Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nancy Wadrago with the University of Illinois Extension Community and Economic Development Program. We're happy to host this webinar here for you today. We have a few remarks. This is in partnership with Rural Partners. We've got Ann Silvas here from Rural Partners who's going to give some remarks and then pass it on to Mark White with our Community and Economic Development Program. And finally, happy to have Jonathan Coppess on today, who will go over discussions around the Farm Bill from a rural economic perspective. And I'll go ahead and pass it over to you, Anne.
Thanks, Nancy, and welcome everyone. I've got my Rural Partners hat on today. I serve on the board of Rural Partners, which is the Illinois Rural Development Council. I don't remember my extension hat anymore because I've retired from extension, but I'm really happy to still be able to participate in this and also very grateful that this partnership serves our rural communities well by bringing university resources out to those of you across the state through the Rural Partners Network. So thanks for participating. Thanks to Extension for providing really good content for our rural communities. I'm going to put the Rural Partners website in the chat so you can explore the website after we're finished here. Thank you.
All right, I guess you'll turn it over to me now.
Yeah, handing it over to you, Mark.
Yeah. I'm Mark White. I wear two hats. I'm a clinical associate professor at the Department of Ag and Consumer Economics here at the University of Illinois. And then on my extension hat, I also am the, interim assistant dean and program leader for community economic development extension, which means I quite literally right now occupy Ann's old office. Anyway, it's with our great pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Mr. Jonathan Coppess, who is a native of Darke County, Ohio. He has extensive experience in federal policymaking, particularly as it relates to agricultural and rural issues. Before joining ACE 13, the Department of Ag and Consumer Economics 13 years ago, he had been in DC for a while, where he was the administrator of the Farm Service Agency and worked on the Senate Ag Committee to help draft several past farm bills. So he knows many of these issues inside and out, and you can read either his books. He's got two books on the history of the Farm Bill and on conservation policy in the Farm Bill too, right? Or if you don't want to read those, you can find his regular contributions to Farm Doc daily, which is pretty much every week. You've got something in there. So with that, I will stop talking and turn it on the mic over to Jonathan right now to tell us what he knows in this age of great uncertainty.
Thank you, Mark, for the introduction and the wonderful promotion of boring history books that nobody wants to read, including students. I also want to thank Ann and Nancy for the intros and the help. And I guess I should probably just begin this the way, the only proper way, which is to apologize for the discussion that's about to unfold. As Mark noted, lots of uncertainty and a lot of, this is not the usual situation. So it's kind of tough to figure some of that out. And so that I guess my first slide is this one. Anybody that's telling you right now they know exactly where this is headed or what's going to happen, you're advised to take caution in that. And I am not somebody that's going to tell you where this is headed because I honestly don't know. The situation is very different. So we're going to try to put this into some context, and then obviously more than happy to answer questions and have a discussion as we go. And I'll try to watch the chat. If something pops up, Mark or Ann or Nancy, please let me know if there's anything of confusion. I tried to avoid too much of the acronym alphabet soup that we tend to get into. So let's just let's hit the basics, right? What is the Farm Bill? We technically think of this in terms of a multi-year omnibus authorizing piece of legislation, right? In other words, it touches all kinds of different topics, programs, and policies in the agricultural, food, forestry, rural spaces. And so the Farm Bill itself is this 1,000-page legislative text that makes amendments and changes all across different parts of federal statutes. And so it's that kind of big legislative vehicle that that may be becoming more of a thing of the past, or being overtaken by other larger legislative vehicles, which we'll talk about. The other thing we'll get into is that it's important to kind of keep in mind it authorizes a lot of mandatory spending, and that's obviously part of what's challenging its fate. And then traditionally, this is a 5-year authorization, so every one of these will contain a sunset date. And the idea, obviously, is that we wanted Congress, or the idea is to have Congress sort of forced into reconsidering these things on a fairly regular basis, updating policies for new and changed circumstances and so forth. And so the last authorization was 2018. It was scheduled to be reauthorized in 2023 when it sort of expired. And now we're in this kind of Groundhog's Day of like, extend it, wait and see what happens, extend it, wait and see what happens. And so we're extended through 2025. And as we'll talk about today, I am not an optimist that this Congress in 2025 is going to actually reauthorize a farm bill in a traditional setting, or what we would call in the legislative, the parlance of legislative talk, which would be the regular order. Committees go in and have the hearings and do markups and write legislation. It goes to the House and Senate floors for amendments and debates. And then we have conference committees. Highly unlikely we see any of that this year. It's more likely that we'll see yet another extension of at least parts of it. But we'll get into the details. And notice here on the right-hand side, I think it's your right-hand side too, this baseline. So we're going to talk some of the budget issues as well. Hold on. Apologies for the sirens. And the budget issues are a big part of it. So we'll come back to those numbers as well. From the rural America, rural communities, rural economic issues, every part of the Farm Bill is going to connect to it in some form or fashion. The most prominent sort of component of this is Title VI of the Farm Bill, which is the rural development title. And this is where we authorize everything from the rural broadband programs, the rural water and waste disposal, community facilities, value-added producer grants, and just a sort of laundry list of different programs and policies that help specifically with rural economic development. We've also seen in recent years these farm bills increase authorizations and even to some extent funding for local foods, local farming efforts, local food network challenges, farmers markets, those sort of things. Obviously, if you've been paying attention to the news, the Trump administration has put some sort of pause, funding freeze, funding elimination. Again, the clarity is not forthcoming from them on a lot of these things, but there's certainly some real jeopardy for a lot of these local food programs that could have a real harsh impact, real damage to small farmers and some of those food systems we've been building up. But those are all in there. We've also got bioenergy programs and bio manufacturing, like loans and grants and those sort of things. That'll be in the Title IX of a farm bill, typically the energy title. But really, pretty much everything in this is going to have some impact in rural America. And just for the history nerds in the group, much of the inclusion of rural economic assistance programs date to 1973, the Farm Bill in 1973, which will have other historical importance as we go forward. And then the other thing I would tell you is a lot of times what we talk about in a farm bill is mandatory funding. And so those are programs that the ag committees authorize spending, and it happens without appropriations. That's not the case for the bulk of rural development. Almost all the rural development programs have to be appropriated. And normally, right, that's a challenge because you get authorized at certain levels and the appropriators make their decisions on what they want to do with those programs. And there's a lot of that kind of back and forth, and it's an annual appropriation cycle. There is a slightly ironic, maybe paradoxical situation in the current moment in which the mandatory programs are probably more at risk or under pressure And while we're not doing appropriations in any normal process, the fact that we keep doing continuing resolutions or big omnibus kind of continuing appropriations does kind of hold the status quo for appropriated policies like in the rule development title, because again, we just keep doing what we did. The continuing resolution just continues what was funded and appropriated the year before. It's a very kind of relatively simple legislative component to just keep the lights on effectively. And so there is an odd situation in which that may help kind of continue some of these rural investments or many of these rural investments. And then this one figure from the Congressional Research Service that talks about programs that had mandatory funding but were not continued, and those are kind of in a limbo state as well. There's a little bit for rural issues in there. That's a bit of a wormhole, so I'll stay out of it. It's just it's an artifact. It's a product of the way of the mandatory funding authorization of the Farm Bill and the budget rules and how they count this. And so some of these funds are at risk, and those will have impacts in rural America. But anyway, that's kind of the broad overview. And obviously, as you can see from these two charts, both of which are by the Congressional Research Service, I mean, we have just a large number of different programs and policies at play here. And it's also kind of a reminder of both the omnibus nature of a farm bill and why we use the omnibus vehicles to be able to package all these things and work efficiently through them. But that's another issue. So again, why is the farm bill in this sort of state of uncertainty, or why is its fate in doubt? It really comes down to the mandatory funding discussion. So the current farm bill, as authorized in 2018 and continued now through 2025, the Congressional Budget Office under budget law is required to project 10-year spending estimates. So they're supposed to use economic modeling to look 10 years into the future, and we call this the baseline. And so this is for mandatory programs with a sufficient level of authorization. What CBO has to do under the statute is they have to take the program as it exists at the year of expiration. So this would have been fiscal year 2023. And they have to presume that Congress makes no changes for 10 years into the future. And then they run economic analysis around that, like crop prices to determine spending, or yield losses that may trigger crop insurance indemnities. And of course, with the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, it's an economic factor of poverty levels and demand for program assistance. So that's the baseline. It also kind of puts this budgetary target, if you will, on the Farm Bill because of the large level of mandatory spending that's there. And we'll get into that a little bit when I talk budget reconciliation. But just for your sort of understanding, CBO's most recent baseline projection from last June has the Farm Bill costing about $1.4 trillion over 10 years. So that's a 10-year number, so about $140 billion a year. And the biggest part of that is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which provides assistance to low-income families to purchase food. It's serving somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 42 million Americans at the moment. So it's a huge program in terms of who it serves and how many, so that sometimes we get caught up in a big budget number and we miss the fact that there's a lot of people who need help and are getting help through this program. But it's this big dollar item that really puts the Farm Bill kind of in the budget. Whenever Congress has this sort of budget fight focus, right? Whenever they're looking to cut spending and offset things like tax cuts and so forth, then they look for items like the Farm Bill where there's mandatory dollars available that you can cut. Oops. So the two main reasons: it spends mandatory money, and nearly 80 to 85% of that is spent on low-income houses. So obviously, depending on the politics of Congress, which right now with Republicans in full control, then these kinds of programs are almost always on the menu of items that they want to cut, or when they're looking for offsets, because these are viewed as less than appropriate for federal funding and taxpayer dollars. The chart you see on the left-hand side is a combination of what we've spent on farm bills going back to 2000. You can see the big jumps around the Great Recession 2008 and in the COVID era. And then it couples that projected spending. So you just kind of see how this thing looks over both what has been spent and then how the CBO projections look. And the bottom line again and again is that SNAP is the biggest spending item in the Farm Bill. So the other thing I want to kind of take just sort of a high level view of. So I talked about how the budget law requires CBO to take this 10-year future projection of what it thinks it's going to spend. We know most of that is spent in the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. But I think sometimes, or I would argue way too often, we get really wrapped up in things like billions and trillions of dollars and 10-year projections of spending, and we kind of miss some more important factors in this. So the other thing I always encourage to do when you look at these baseline projections for a Farm Bill is to also think of it in terms of the political coalition that it takes to get legislation through Congress, right? You got to amass 218 votes in the House. You probably got to get 60 votes in the Senate. They've got to work through committees and conference committees. So there's this whole complex process in which that coalition helps you move legislation. It brings supporters and votes to that legislation. So that baseline is also kind of a reminder of the Farm Bill's coalition. Again, SNAP has been a part of the Farm Bill since 1973. So the same year that rural development was added to the Farm Bill, SNAP was added. It used to be called food stamps. That first time that was authorized by Congress was further back into 1964. So this is not only a long-standing kind of policy, it's also been a long-running, over 50 years now, in which it has been one of the key components of the Farm Bill coalition to move the legislative vehicle through Congress. And so it has been a critical part of it. I imagine anybody's paid attention to this story knows where I'm headed on this and the threats to the Farm Bill, but it largely revolves around challenges to SNAP. I've also got the other main mandatory program areas in the baseline. So the farm programs and the direct subsidy payments to farmers, those were first created in 1933. Crop insurance, the federally subsidized crop insurance program was created in 1938, really kind of languishes until the mid 90s and then in the year 2000 when they kind of authorized a major reform of it. But it got pulled into the Farm Bill's baseline efforts back in the 2008 Farm Bill for strange reasons that we can go to if anybody likes trivia and trivial matters. And then finally, conservation assistance, right? Helping farmers adopt practices on their farm that reduce soil erosion and dust storms, reduce nutrient losses to waterways, help restore habitat and those sort of things. Those policies really date to the Dust Bowl era of the mid-1930s, so 1935, 1936 legislation. And then the modern version of this dates to 1985, when we recreated conservation during the great economic crisis and soil erosion crisis for agriculture in the 80s. And since 85, we've been authorizing these programs, reauthorizing these programs, and actually increasing them and increasing the spending. But you kind of see the baseline sort of bringing all this together into the Farm Bill coalition, but you can also see the kind of political pain points, if you will, where a focus on spending is likely, depending on interest and partisan concern, where it's likely to focus. All right, so this takes me to maybe the most painful or esoteric and strange part of this discussion, because where we're headed is, like I said, not the regular order for Farm Bill authorization or reauthorization. We are headed right now into budget reconciliation. And I apologize for talking budget policy, but we can't get away from it. So budget reconciliation is an oddity created in 1974, frankly, by the Congressional Budget Control and Impoundment Act of 1974, which had kind of set in obscurity until members of the current administration thought it wise to think that they can challenge its constitutionality. And we're seeing that play out right now as between funding freezes and whether they can impound funds or unilaterally not spend what Congress instructed them to spend. Those fights are playing out in the courts and as between the Article 2 branch and the administration and the judges right now. But what reconciliation is Congress's process. Again, it's created in 74. It's drastically modified in the early 80s to become what it is now, which the way this works is that every year Congress is supposed to create a budget for itself. It does this through what's called a joint concurrent resolution or current resolution on the budget. And it is simply an agreement between the House and Senate, the two chambers, their budget committees work this all up. And they say, here's the budget for fiscal year 2026, which would start in September. And then they provide these allocations that go to the appropriators, and from those allocations, appropriations committees then write their appropriations bills. That's kind of the usual process. There's an option in budget resolution in the budget law that allows them to put instructions in there for reconciliation. What this has evolved into is the ability for the budget resolution to instruct authorizing committees to go in and change legislation, or to write legislation that changes statutory provisions within their jurisdiction to meet the instruction. And most often that is an instruction to cut spending. And what happens then is each committee reports out this legislation. The budget committees compile this into a gigantic omnibus reconciliation bill, which then speeds through Congress on fast track procedural rules, which in effect eliminates things like the Senate filibuster and limits the amount of amendments and time for consideration. And so what we do is we tend to have this become a very partisan thing. So Republicans in Congress are likely the only ones involved in this process. Democrats are expected to vote all against it and oppose it. And so it becomes a very partisan exercise. But what happens then is they put these instructions in there and the committees are required to meet it. So the example I have on the screen right now is the House provisions for reconciliation in the current budget resolution, which was just agreed to by the House before they went on recess. So the Senate agreed to it. So we're in this process now. And the House reconciliation instructions have told the Committee on Agriculture in the House to cut $230 billion out of the projected spending in its jurisdiction. So this is almost exclusively expected to hit the SNAP program. And so it likely is going to cut SNAP. It may do some other stuff in the Farm Bill realm, and then that'll get pulled into this large reconciliation bill and moved, they hope, on expedited procedures. But that number should stick out. To my knowledge, there's never been an instruction of that magnitude to either House or Senate Ag committees in any budget process. And so we are watching unfold at the moment a drastic reduction in spending from the Farm Bill. Now, it's $230 over 10 years. It's a $1.4 trillion 10-year cost. So I don't want to pretend that it's, the entire thing, but it's the kind of political and often partisan process that has implications much further. So thinking about reconciliation and the fact that that's going to consume Congress for many months to come, and then it's likely to upend the sort of traditional understanding of the politics and the coalition around a Farm Bill. One of the things we have been trying to do is sort of handicap, like, what does this look like? How does this play out? Who's going to win or lose? And so here's my strange little graphic trying to sort that out. Based on the reconciliation instructions, they're telling committees throughout Congress they need to come up with somewhere around $1.55 trillion in reduction. That includes the $230 billion the House Ag Committee. In the strange land of congressional budgeting, this is intended as the offset for a projected at least $4.7 trillion in tax cut and changes or extensions of tax cuts. So yes, this is not an offset completely. It barely gets, it's not even half of what they're expected to spend, but this is the way they negotiated out the budget. So as we think about these things, who's going to win? And in terms of how the committees try to meet this, meet this reconciliation instruction, I think, again, this is only within the Republican caucus. Democrats are irrelevant to this discussion, really. They can only kind of come up with things that might, cause problems, or like poison pills and those sorts of things. So within the Republican caucus is what we're looking at is basically a contest between the budget hawk factions, those who want to see bigger cuts, threatened to hold up the resolution earlier because they didn't think it cut enough, and who are likely to push for more reductions, versus what I've been calling the boll weevils, which is borrowing a phrase from the 80s when they called Democrats in the House from the South were called boll weevil Democrats as they sided with Reagan as against their caucus. Of course, the boll weevils are a pest for cotton, so the southern the southern connections are there. So anyway, what's in favor for the budget hawks? The majority. President Trump is going to back this. This is, I think he's been calling it his one big beautiful bill. Reconciliation is a huge omnibus process and legislation. So there'll be a lot of things in there that everybody wants to support, like trillions of dollars in tax cuts that may offset any of the things they don't like. And then there's this need for at least $1.5 trillion to $1.55 trillion in offset. So it's going to almost have to include something from the Farm Bill. It's almost going to have to include SNAP. On the other side of this contest, the things that kind of sit in the favor of the farm, the traditional farm support, the farm payment supporters, like the Southern boll weevils, right? So the way it works is the committee has to write the legislation. So this kicks the spending requirement down to the committee. That's chaired by John Bozeman, from Senator from Arkansas. And on the House side, it's Chairman G.T. Thompson from Pennsylvania. But the bill they worked on obviously had a lot of Southern influence, a lot of kind of increasing federal farm payments was one of the priorities. So we expect them to kind of look at it that way. So they hold the gavels. They're going to write the legislation. It's possible that they could try and boost farm program payments while cutting SNAP and other things, and that the SNAP cuts may be enough to sort of appease the budget hawks and allow them to sneak some things through. And again, these aren't the biggest items in the budget, so the ability to get creative, while particularly limited in the Senate, is there. And so we could see some odd things put together in this. And again, these slim majorities could empower any one faction over the other, and add intrigue, at least within the Republican caucus, over that. And I've just added some highlights from budget reconciliation to give you a sense of what they're doing, right? So they're telling Ways and Means, which is the tax writers in the House, to increase the deficit by $4.5 trillion. They're increasing Homeland Security for immigration, Judiciary for immigration, and then you're seeing the others, the partially offsetting cuts involved. And again, the Farm Bill at $1.4 trillion is a target. So what's the rural perspective on this? I mean, I feel kind of silly telling any of you this, you know this, but from the Farm Bill's kind of, through the Farm Bill lens, right, we're doing a lot of rural economic development and assistance on the ground, from biomanufacturing to local producers. While much of this funding is appropriated, it has to be reauthorized, or should be reauthorized, and how long the appropriations run, or how much, how this all works. If reconciliation takes one big chunk out of it, I honestly don't know. It certainly upends the process. All of the focus is likely to be on SNAP. There's no way around that reality in the current context of Congress and the current focus of Congress, the partisan issues and the fact that this is low income assistance. Exactly how they do it, I don't know. That's one of my big questions, is how do you take 230, maybe 300 billion, right? So if you've got to meet a $230 billion reduction instruction, and you're also trying to boost farm program payments, then you're going to take more to get that at a net 230. And so one of the things you kind of hear rumors about is they take even more money out of SNAP and they tuck in the farm payment increases they've been wanting to do, which get increasingly expensive to do that as prices come down, or as prices are lower than they were projected. And of course, with the tariff conflict and trade wars going on, the potential that price projections go even lower and these programs become even more expensive, right? You kind of see this sort of feed into each other. So my expectation, the expectation of anybody I've seen talk about this, is that the reconciliation bill will take a huge chunk, somewhere again between $230 billion to $300+ billion out of the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. This has real implications everywhere, but it certainly does in rural America. Too often, I think the SNAP program gets framed as this urban issue, and we're just dealing. It's just for the cities, the poor people in the cities, and that's not true. We have an unfortunately high level of and high amount of poverty throughout rural America. Again, I'm telling you things you all already know. But hitting food assistance is going to hit rural communities. It's going to challenge the poverty situation already there. And then I think what doesn't get talked enough about, but that Mark and others have done some really great work on, and that we've tried to dig into a little bit, is the sort of cost differential in rural communities. So we have challenges like small towns without grocery stores or without a functioning place to get food. So you got to drive more, and if the costs of transportation increase and the time to do so increases, these are actually more profound or more pronounced challenges in rural communities when this food assistance program is cut or the implications flow back out pretty quickly. And so I do think from a rural perspective, hits to the SNAP program are likely to be really problematic. I mean, I think they're going to have impacts in small towns, and that's something to be concerned about. Look, on the other side of this ledger, whether it's through the reconciliation process or through USDA unilaterally issuing payments, the large commercial farmers are likely to continue to get payments. They're probably going to receive more payments. They got $10 billion on the way right now from the end of last year's appropriation bill. They're likely to see more. The administration's indicated that the tariff conflicts that are hurting crop markets are likely to result in more payments being issued by USDA if they can figure out how to do it. But I don't know that necessarily helps rural communities. I think one of the challenges we've seen is the consolidation in agriculture and some of these larger, bigger operators that are not quite the same as the same players, the same kind of rural connection that maybe we traditionally think of as the farmer going into town and being an important patron of the local businesses. I don't think that's necessarily the case, and I don't know that these payments necessarily work to the benefit of rural communities, but I think that's something that I have a sense of, but I don't have a research back around that to talk about. The other threat here is the conservation spending, and that could impact rural communities, particularly things like water quality and the cost to clean nitrogen and nitrate out of local drinking water supplies. Cutting conservation could impact recreational areas, could impact hunting and hiking demand and traffic, and so those could also have impacts on rural America, as well as water and soil and dust storms and those sort of challenges. So we'll watch and see how this plays out, but these are some of the implications or potential implications in small towns and rural communities. And then again, I just tried to pull, like, in my head, wanting to try to connect these dots a little bit and try to make sense of this. I think you all probably can do a better job of this than me. And so I just kind of throw this out as more, reinforcement and food for thought. Again, poverty rates are significant in rural areas. And so I think anything that's going to hit the SNAP program is going to very quickly ripple back through small towns as people struggle to put food on the table. Just as sort of a note, the SNAP benefits, the calculation kind of begins at 130% of poverty using a gross income, and then they take out deductions, and it's 100% of poverty with deductions. But where we see, and this is a USDA report on county poverty levels, where we see those high levels of poverty are clearly where we're going to see cuts to SNAP hit first. And again, none of this takes into account what we talked about a minute ago, which is just how inflation has played out in rural areas and how much more of an impact high food costs, grocery bills, transportation costs have been. And that's likely to be a big part of it as well. And then since Mark's a part of this discussion, I had to kind of shamelessly grab some of his work. And this is from a Farm Doc Daily article he put out a while back, which is this sort of looking at the percent total income represented by government transfer payments. And that's everything, right? That's not just SNAP, that's not just farm programs, but it's the kind of the whole universe of transfer payments.
Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, veterans benefits, et cetera. Yeah.
Right. And so the obvious point with including Mark's map here is that if we cut any of these federal programs, right, we're going to see the darker blue counties are going to feel those cuts even more. And so obviously those are many rural counties, particularly throughout the South, but in Illinois, challenges as well. And then I kind of made this point, and again, borrowing from Mark's work and then from a Brookings study, trying to combine some things here. So, forgive me for my amateur analysis on this. But, we too often, I think, in the congressional debate, people conflate paying farmers with helping rural areas. And so one of the things I was trying to think through here is, what does that look like? And you can see even at the highest level, 42% or so of employment in the farm sector in some of these counties in the plains, and kind of leave you to draw your conclusions on, okay, how much would those payments, maybe filter back through the community or have impacts if those increase, but other things go away. Offsetting loss of SNAP, is not going to be helped by additional payments to farmers. I also think this Brookings study is kind of fascinating, but I don't know quite what to do with it, is the comparison between the economies in rural and urban areas, and who's got more in manufacturing and those sort of things. Again, I think a lot of this is intuitive. It does add perspective for when we take away payments or we kind of reshift some of these things, like how this is going to filter through. But it also kind of hits me with this. Oh, this is not the one I wanted. This one. Sorry, I'll come back to that one. And the New York Times had this article out the other day that it just struck me. Again, the impacts of the manufacturing shift, particularly to China, and how that has impacted these communities differently or disparately. So, one, a reminder that the tariff, there is a nugget of real issue behind the tariff discussions of the current administration and trying to deal with what has happened for many years now as far as Chinese manufacturing and the taking over of many, or the shipping over many jobs, and how that has really been concentrated in rural areas and hollowing out those rural areas. I would maybe argue that the blunt instrument of a tariff policy, particularly when you wage tariff war on the entire world, is probably not the most ideal way to address a real challenge in rural communities, but that's an argument maybe for another time. I think this sort of feeds into the perspective of how what we're seeing take hold in reconciliation. I just have a hard time imagining that it's not going to have real impacts on many rural communities, and particularly those that have already been hit hardest by what's happened the last 20 or 30 years in trade policy, again, the manufacturing jobs and so forth. So I don't know quite how to tie all those threads together, other than to sort of highlight that in the conversation that there's real pain, that these cuts are likely to hit those same areas that have had some real challenges. And then this chart was looking back over some of the farm assistance. And one of the things that I think jumps out most here is that really since the 2008 Farm Bill, we've seen a drastic shift from sort of the traditional farm payments to these ad hoc payments, the market facilitation program payments that happened after the 2018 tariff conflict with China, the COVID payments and the continuing kind of level of ad hoc assistance. Those ad hoc programs are not a part of the Farm Bill. They're not reauthorized by Congress in the Farm Bill. They're either done unilaterally by the administration, or they're done through appropriations, like the $10 billion additional assistance from last year. But it drastically complicates the politics, because the Farm Bill works in the baseline space with 10-year projections, and these things are emergency funded with no baseline and no kind of offsetting requirements. We set up a situation, I think, in the last 5 years in particular, in which farmers have become accustomed to these large payments coming out in an ad hoc process that can't be replicated in a Farm Bill. You simply don't have the baseline funding to do that, or you need the offsets to do it. And so this is also complicating getting a Farm Bill done. It's also something you can't really plan for, and so there's a lot of uncertainty around this. But I think this just sort of as a perspective on the farm program side of things. And where this comes into play then politically is if these farm program payments are less relevant to a key factional constituency like the farm groups, because they're more reliant on or more connected to the ad hoc assistance, then they have less reason to do a farm bill. And the coalition kind of breaks down in that sense as well, which likely, impacts whether or not there's a willingness to cut the SNAP program and other types of assistance. Because if you don't see the farm bill as the needed vehicle, the coalition matters to you less. And so I do think this factors into it. This does complicate the regular process. It does complicate the coalitional politics. How exactly, I'm not sure, but it does raise some questions. And again, the challenges in rural America. And then finally, Mark, this is still my favorite graph that I've worked on with you so far, but this is just to tee us up to do more work in the future, because this comes back to SNAP and this crazy dynamic that Mark has highlighted in this graph, which is the sort of change between unemployment levels, and we've seen these lower and lower unemployment levels since the Great Recession, but SNAP and poverty have kind of maybe not gone the opposite direction, but they've separated quite a bit. And so SNAP is a poverty program, right? It's not an unemployment program, even though the two are typically related. And there's a lot of things this makes me think about, like why we're seeing poverty and unemployment kind of separate like this, and how much of that is, the anecdotal kind of story of like the poor single mother or the poor working household in which you're working 2 jobs and you still can't make ends meet because you can't get more than 20 hours, and you're working at a store that pays you minimum wage. And so there's a lot of the things that possibly go into this. The bottom line for me is that cutting the food assistance does nothing to help with this situation. What we're looking to do is reduce spending. It's not in any way trying to fix the program or improve program operation. It's really just a bottom line, let's cut numbers out of the budget. So it's not going to reduce hunger. It's not going to fix whatever's going on here in this gap. But it will, project the savings that can be used to offset tax cuts. And then obviously, coming back to the beginning of this conversation, without SNAP and this coalition, it's really hard to see a path forward for a farm bill. The future for that big omnibus legislative vehicle we've been doing for the last 50 years with SNAP, but all the way back to 33, now is just in a realm of uncertainty that's hard to understand. So that's kind of it. Mark mentioned, so I got a little shameless promotion for the history nerds in the group. If you want some history on this, by all means, I know 2 boring books that will provide you as much of that as you can tolerate. But,
for what it's worth, I looked these up on Amazon this morning, and there was 16 copies left, 17 copies left of another one. So I think they're flying off the shelves. So
they are not flying off the shelves. That is the Amazon marketing gimmick to say, pretend there's none left, so you'll buy the ones they've already bought. You can get it from University of Nebraska Press directly if you don't want to support Amazon. But anyway, that's my story for the moment. I will stop this.
If people have questions, they can.
Yeah, I'm happy to take any questions or comments.
In the chat, or one of the things that struck me, Jonathan, is that we don't really have earmarks anymore, which kind of used to be used to help make deals, right? And so is that, as you think about, I was thinking in terms of like the infrastructure spending that might come through RD, that may be something if you have a congressperson who has, I need this water project done in my community. If you fund that, then I'll vote for X or I'll support this. And so we don't have those things anymore. And if that money disappears and earmarks don't exist, then how do rural communities get access to things like that they simply can't afford on their own, and states can't afford on their own?
Yes, I mean, it's a great question. We're seeing, I would just say, as part of a larger, the earmark issue is kind of like the grease in the gears, right? It was small, but it helped, to your point, it helped bring people to a large bill like this who may not otherwise be that interested in it. And so if you're adamantly opposed, it probably didn't do anything, that you were going to maybe get a bridge or a fire station.
Mhm.
But it did help kind of bring people to the legislation. So without those things, yeah, it makes it more difficult to get any legislation through. But that's only, I mean, to be honest, Mark, like that's just part of the issue, right? We're just sort of like cramming these things into omnibus bills now and just jamming them through in kind of like the last minute, because we just can't legislate right now. Congress for years has not been able to do appropriations in a normal way. And I'm kind of sort of thinking in almost like this weird mindset of like the Farm Bill may have been like one of the last sort of big coalitional legislative vehicles. And that's just, it's not in the cards right now for Congress. It's all these kind of very partisan, these reconciliation things, these sort of last minute, if we don't pass this, we shut down the government kind of bills. And in that case, you don't even need earmarks, because it's really just the threat that's the case. So I think it's one of the symptoms, if you will, one of the items that's made it harder. But it strikes me that if this reconciliation bill goes through and we do sever SNAP, that I don't know that what we've long thought of a farm bill. It's no longer in the sort of legislative cards, and so I don't know what that looks like, and I don't think there's any amount of earmarks, frankly, that help it. There's nothing that has that coalitional strength that the SNAP does, right? But it's a good question. It's a wonderfully tough thing.
Okay, so we have a question of, do you think land conservation projects and programs will see impact the public land versus private land conservation funding? What do you see as the future of that?
Yeah, so a couple of things. The conservation programs in the Farm Bill are for private lands. And so you're providing, voluntary financial assistance to private landowners. Farm Bill reauthorizes things for the Forest Service, which is at USDA. But that's really the only kind of public land component of it. And so then the answer to the question is, I expect cuts to conservation programs in some form or fashion through reconciliation, some reduction in spending. I'm not at the bleak point yet where I think they eliminate those or drastically gut them, but I can see some real cuts to conservation spending for private lands. On the public land side, there's most of the pressure there, I think, is coming from the administration. They want to make drastic cuts to the Forest Service, to employees. There's real pressure to what I keep seeing the headlines that the president wants to sell off public lands to oil companies and other high bidders to let them do with them what they want. So I think there's those kinds of pressures to the public land side of it that's left of a Farm Bill issue. But again, coming back to we often think about these too narrowly. And so when we invest in conservation, we invest in public lands and do it these are draws for people to come to areas where those exist. Those are recreational areas, hunting, hiking, and fishing. So they have ripple effects through rural communities around those areas, hotels and restaurants that are real and that reverberate in the community because those are bringing dollars in. And so I have a lot of concern that cuts to those things or drastic changes to public lands and even conservation is, it's the kind of thing you're what, a penny wise and a pound foolish. You might cut some spending out of it and then look up in 3 years and see the devastation to rural communities again because you don't have the same kind of traffic and recreation dollar. So anyway, that was a long answer. It was a good question. What advice not to panic? Valerie, so I never want to advise panic. Panic is never a good strategy. a sarcastic answer might be transfer all your panic to your member of Congress. The ones that need to hear about this and hear real concerns are going to be in Congress. But what advice to give? I don't know. I mean, the uncertainty around what happens to the funding makes it hard to be strategic and plan for it. I do think a lot of communities have some, probably some triage kind of budgeting scenarios. But it really is, I worry that there's more of a risk of understatement or underestimate of what might happen than like, again, I don't want to advise panic, but I want to stress that there could be some real substantive pain that hit rural communities out of what we're seeing, both from the administration, that includes the tariff stuff, and in this budget reconciliation effort. I really do think rural communities need to be concerned. They need to voice those concerns, and they have to plan for, I think, some really tough scenarios because the direction right now is all one way, and it's all cutting assistance, with the single exception of farm program payments or farm payments. Sorry, I know I should be giving better answers and more optimistic answers, but I struggle to dig out optimism in my dark cloud perspectives. And Mark can vouch for me on that. Every time he talks to me, I think he walks away feeling.
The dark cloud follows you around.
What about CRP and grain? Joan, the CRP program. Thanks for raising that. The CRP program, I presume it does not take a big cut, but there will be pressure on it. There's always pressure on it. I think what you're asking, on the other side of that is if we are watching tariffs destroy export markets, it's kind of hard to argue to bring more land back into production. We certainly don't need that. So there could be some strange counter pressure to increase the CRP and take more acres out of production because, we've decimated the soybean market, China. But I don't know where that might head, whether it's on the chopping block or not. It's a pretty big program. It spends about $2 billion a year. We got about 27 million acres in the program. So it's at risk whenever these conversations are a budget reconciliation or budget cutting exercise. But I do think there's counter pressures right now because of the market concerns and uncertainties. To what extent does the Farm Bill Coalition extend to the Ag Committee members? It absolutely. I mean, the Ag Committees are the first kind of group for the coalition. I think the bigger issue is that this being a partisan exercise, is there counter pressure on those committee members as they write reconciliation instructions to somehow keep this all together and protect SNAP or not go overboard on SNAP? Although I don't know how with a $230 billion instruction to cut. I don't know how it doesn't take a huge chunk out of SNAP. So it's a good question. It's a kind of a tough reality. Normally, again, that coalition works because you're bringing in both sides of the aisle. You're bringing in kind of that big middle, the big center. So both wings of the party, both of the extreme kind of factional interests in both parties, tend to not be the primary interest in this. But when we're doing reconciliation, it changes that dynamic. And so the coalition matters less. And in fact, again, my concern is that we do a lot of damage to the coalition that can't be easily repaired in a relative amount of time.
One of the other things too is you mentioned the payments to farmers is, I guess, maybe being seen as like offsetting some of this. It seems kind of a very, I don't want to say simplistic, but that's the word I'm thinking. Simple, like this will be the simple way to stop to counter, but without understanding the full range of things. But when you think about like the money from SNAP or some of these other programs that go into community, that's money that's actually being spent in communities and keeping those local grocery stores in business or keeping people in jobs. And we also know we're keeping schools open for keeping people there and keeping schools open as opposed to being consolidated because there's too few people. Or one of the things too that's always struck me is that with our image of farmers, we think of the big farm operator or the family farms that sustain people, but I think the number is like 77 or 78% of medium farm household income comes from off-farm sources. So in many ways, the ag sector needs a strong Main Street to just survive because it's that spousal job that provides, health insurance or regular income over the course of, stable income over the course of the year, or for that matter, having the operator having, income in the wintertime, for instance. So like all these things are connected, and I think it's
Yes.
it's to your point, like with the example of the lands and hunting and fishing, it's that we need to think not just A does B, but A does B, C, D, E, F, X, Y, Z, etc. And like those ripple effects, I think, are really important to keep in mind.
Yeah. And I think like anything, all these things are connected, whether it's urban or rural, but in your rural areas, those connections are, more pronounced. You have fewer people and so forth. And so I think it has a bigger impact. And I don't want to leave the impression that helping farmers doesn't help rural communities. There's that connection obviously is extremely important, but I do think there's a risk that we overconflate those. And oftentimes this conversation is like, oh, we'll pay farmers and rural America is fine. Well, that's not reality either.
Mm-hmm.
And so it can't be that one is sacrificed for the other. And I think that's part of the challenge. Because Mark, I absolutely agree with you. Like those SNAP dollars are going to local grocery stores. I mean, local stores in general, if they're there, they're helping, the school lunch program and school feeding and again, the last thing I think we need in rural America is any more pressure to leave, and anything that sort of feeds that, like, well, this is hopeless here, let's move on, is going to be a problem. It's going to add to the problems we've seen with like the manufacturing issues, right? But we've already seen the hollowing out, and if we keep hollowing out, it's not getting better. And no amount of helping farmers is going to offset that, even if it helps some. And so I guess that's kind of my point, that it shouldn't be conflated.
All right. Well,
other questions? Yeah.
Any other questions? All right. I think we have a survey that we would like people to take to hopefully you've learned a lot. This is kind of like doing this in class.
You don't ask if they learned anything they wanted to learn, right?
Oh, yeah.
I'm not held to that standard.
All right. Well, Jonathan, thank you very much for taking the time to do this. We really appreciate it. And everyone else, thank you for taking the time to join us. We appreciate that as well. And stay tuned for more regular programming from the local government education program, which will maybe not follow the dark cloud that follows Jonathan around, but that's yeah.
Well, thanks for having me.
Balls, right? It's like because the dark cloud blocks out the sun, right. And it doesn't grow.
What happens?
Anyway,
thanks for having me, Mark and everybody, and good luck with things. Take care.
All right, thank you.